So big hello to all, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating an Inclusive Culture to Attract and Retain the Best Talent. Now we have some exciting content to share with all of you today and an esteemed panel of speakers. So thank you all for joining us today. First of all, let me introduce myself and our speakers for today's session. My name is Monty Sujanani, and I'm the country manager for our Robert Walters business in Singapore. And I'm going to kick things off with a brief update on the recruitment perspective and why inclusivity is such a hot topic in today's global job market. Also joining us today, we are so pleased to welcome some guest speakers who will be sharing their expertise and experience with all of us. First up, we will have Dan Robertson, Director at VERCIDA Consulting, a specialty ED&I consultancy, which we have been working with over the last year. Now we also have a dear friend of mine, Dr. Chaya Darsina, Head of ED&I for Asia and Middle East Africa at Levi's. And another dear friend, John Nichols, Senior Director and Country Lead for PayPal up in the Philippines. Now, before we get started though, I'd like to give you all a quick short overview of who we are at the Robert Walters Group. Now, we are a specialist professional recruitment business with offices spanning across 31 countries and have been operating for over 36 years. Now, the group encompasses of 3 global brands. We've got Robert Walters, our specialist professional recruitment business specializing in permanent and contract placements. We have Walters People, our specialist staffing business. Last but definitely not least, we've got Resource Solutions, our recruitment process outsourcing business. Now, we work across a range of disciplines, across from accounting and finance to sales and marketing and technology, just to name a few. And our passion, which is a big core value here with the group, is to help people grow their careers and to help businesses build effective teams. Now, before I hand over to our speakers, I'm going to start today's session with a quick look at the current recruitment market, as we primarily talking about how a culture of inclusivity can help your organization better attract and also importantly retain top talent. Now, at the end of last year, Forbes reported that the global talent shortage had reached a staggering 40 million skilled workers worldwide. Now, we'd seen a growing talent shortage in previous years due to a number of factors, but without a doubt, the extreme economic conditions created by the global pandemic threw the entire global jobs market into a full-on war of talent. Now, I'm sure if there are any hiring managers in this session today, you would know the challenge of finding talent. And trust me, that's what is keeping us up at night. Now, adding to these economic conditions, we've also seen what has been described as the Great Resignation, as life in lockdown has driven many professionals to reassess what they want from their careers, often seeking better work-life balance and looking for more fulfillment than their previous 9-to-5 office roles. But today's talent isn't just looking at careers in isolation. They want to know that the businesses they work for or want to work for are purpose-driven organizations with a clear set of ethical values. For example, in a recent study from the Robert Walters Group, which we did, more than 55% of professionals said that they would actually decline a job offer if they felt that the company's values did not align with their own. As a result, business leaders have been forced to take notes. Companies are addressing their diversity gaps from the top down, while a huge increase in the hiring of diversity and inclusion professionals signals the ever-increasing importance of building an inclusive culture that represents a diverse range of viewpoints, backgrounds, and experiences. Now, it's no longer a nice to have, that's long gone, it's a business imperative. So with that as a little bit of a scene setting, I'm now going to hand over to Dan Robertson, who's going to give us a bit more context as to the current state of play in the ED&I space before we get to also hear from our other speakers. Now, just a little bit I wanted to mention to everyone, don't forget, you've got the chat box and the Q&A there, so please submit your questions as we go on, and we will answer them at the end during our Q&A segment. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over the floor to Dan. Over to you, Dan.
Great, thanks, Monty. Good, hello, everybody. It's just great to be on the webinar today. I tell you one thing actually, which is really interesting, is I've worked in the field of diversity and inclusion for about 20 years. I've never seen the market so hot on this topic, and I think there are a number of kind of strategic reasons for that actually. So we'll hopefully explore some of those as we go through the session. For me, I think it's important that we start off by actually being really clear in terms of what we're actually talking about here. So actually, if you've just gone to the next slide, let's start with some kind of definition setting. One of the things that we need to think about as organizations is, are we really clear in terms of our language and the strategic objectives that we're trying to achieve? The first starting point for any organization on their inclusion journey is to ensure that they understand the differences and make a strategic connection between operationalizing diversity and operationalizing inclusivity. So what do we mean by all of that stuff? First of all, I love this quote, by the way, from Werner Myers, which is, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And then somebody's added a sentence on the end, which is belonging is dancing like nobody is watching. And I think that articulates something interesting, which is when we think about diversity, so a definition of diversity is simply about difference. So when we talk about diversity, it's about all of the characteristics that we possess. So those core ones, such as somebody's gender, their age, their ethnicity, their cultural background, their disability, etc. But when I think of diversity, I'm thinking much broader than that. So for me, diversity is those core elements plus things like somebody's social background, their thinking styles, whether they're an introvert, whether they're an extrovert, etc. So diversity is simply about difference in a broad sense. And historically and today, there is a huge focus for corporations to think about how they can increase their levels of difference in order to do something, which we'll come on to a second. So we want to increase our levels of representation. And the reason for that is when we have organizations which are populated by people that, look the same, sound the same, think the same, etc., that's a problem. It creates groupthink. So we want to increase our levels of difference in order to reduce groupthink, but get a positive uptake, which is innovation, creativity, and all those business case arguments, which some of you are familiar with. So that's fairly straightforward, actually. But I think what's interesting for me is there's now a movement towards saying, and the evidence really points to this quite clearly, is that having an organization which is high on diversity but low on organizational inclusivity is problematic. And if we want to get any business rewards, what we need to do is make a strategic connection between high levels of difference and high levels of inclusivity and belonging. So what do we mean by belonging and diversity and inclusion? So whilst diversity is about difference, inclusion really is the sense of, do you work in an organizational culture where you can be yourself? Do you feel that you have a voice? Is difference respected? Does it have a seat at the table? So what we're seeing in the global marketplace actually is not really a move from to. So we're not moving from diversity to inclusion, but we're now seeing a conversation which is really starting to articulate this strategic connection between saying, as we start to increase our levels of organizational difference, we have the culture which respects, values, etc., people that are in there. So that's the first starting point, is that we need to be really clear in terms of the language we're using and the definitions we're working in. So let's just go briefly to the next slide, actually. So if we think about why we're doing this. And somebody said something really interesting to me the other day. Actually, I thought it was quite interesting. So, you know, we're all used to talking about the war for talent. And somebody said to me, hey, Dan, the war for talent is over. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And what they essentially said is talent's won the argument. And as Monty said at the beginning, actually, of the session is, you know, there's this idea of the great resignation and things like that. And I think it is now true, and I see this with all of my global clients, is that the market is so hot that talent is in a position where it can pick and choose who it wants to work for. And I think that presents a fundamental shift in terms of the value proposition which organizations are offering. And without question, we are fundamentally seeing a reflection of can I work for an organization that matches or mirrors my values? And that is one of the core articulations which, you know, individuals globally are thinking about now. And so I think that's really interesting, actually. So if we are operating within this context of the war for talent is over and the need to increase our levels of organizational diversity and inclusion, that puts more emphasis on organizations to articulate why it's important for us to do that. And I've kind of set out some areas what I see as the key kind of outputs from this, actually. But let's hear from you. So we're going to go into a poll now, actually. And I'd like to launch the poll, and we'll see, you know, in terms of the kind of drivers or the kind of key outputs, you know, where you see the key wins here. So if we go into the poll, so you'll see the poll question on the screen there. So what do you see as the key rewards from creating an inclusive work culture? So you've got the 5 kind of options. So we'll give you a minute or two, and then we'll see what the results are. Okay, so I think we pretty much can wrap up with the poll. And if we can see the results. There we go. Interesting, actually. So you can see the results there. So 50% saying emotional connectivity, business loyalty and retention, actually. So, I mean, Chaya, any thoughts from you in terms of those poll results you can see there?
Well, thank you, Dan, and hello, everyone. I'm grateful to be here today sharing my voice and experiences on a topic that truly matters, not just to an individual or a company, but the collective future of the global workforce. While the poll question was being asked, last 9 years of my dedicated career as a DEI leader flashed through my eyes, and I sincerely hoped that majority attending the webinar today would have voted for inclusivity as the key enabler to attract and retain talent. And I'm relieved to see the numbers. Well, relieved and patient, because one of my biggest learning in this journey of understanding and driving inclusion across organizations and cultures has been to have the courage and compassion to meet people where they are rather than preaching from a podium. To me, creating inclusive cultures is a combination of continuously checking the pulse of the organization and to curate strategy and solutions, ideally in a proactive fashion, to meet the needs of the company, clients or consumers, and community at large. There are many models out there to explain the inclusion continuum and how an organization crawls, stumbles, walks, runs, and eventually learns to put in play the balance across the different stages of the continuum. And probably that's what we see as response to the poll on the screen right now. For most organizations in Asia Pacific with headquarters in the West, the journey usually starts from understanding and educating the regional organization on the global strategy, then diagnosing the diversity strands that truly matter, from a market or country perspective, followed by assimilating data insights considering the global corporate commitments. Thereon, designing and executing a regional strategy that aims to mobilize an inclusive ecosystem with state-of-art policy and infrastructure, leadership support and advocacy, and continuous education and awareness efforts to bring the desired behaviors in play, which ignite a culture of respect, psychological safety, inclusion, and belonging, where talent thrives and positively impacts the P&L. For today's session, I would like to share a specific DEI program that has been executed at Levi Strauss & Company, which is already showcasing improved inclusion index and promises to sustainably make the organizational culture more inclusive. That leads to attract and retain top talent. I would request to move to the first slide of my deck, please.
Joe, before you do that, actually, I just wanted to get John's input onto the poll.
Sure, yes.
And then we'll loop back to you. So, John, just in terms of those initial poll results, any reflections?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with the points that Chaya was making as well. But I don't think there's any wrong answer on that, and you can see the connectivity between each of those points. You know, the insightful decision making that we were talking about on that slide, that comes from an inclusive environment that leads to employees being engaged, that leads to that the brand and talent of an organization. It leads to that element of emotional connectivity, which ultimately the outcome is business profits, as has been proven time and time again. So absolutely, there's no wrong answer there. All of those are benefits of inclusion, and it just emphasizes why we really need to work hard at creating that inclusive environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think it's interesting that they're all fundamentally interconnected, aren't they? This idea that, you know, if you have diversity and a sense of inclusivity, belonging, that psychological safety, that creates that well-being, it creates that emotional connection, and then we get the kind of spiral effects in terms of productivity, reward, all of those things. So that's really, really super useful. I've just got a couple of other things to say, and then Chaya, I'll come back to you actually. So if we just go on to the next slide, just a couple of points. I think it's really important to articulate that actually we can, you know, people often say to me, Dan, you know, I can measure diversity, I can get people to, you know, tick some boxes and things like that and get a sense of who they are. But how do we measure inclusion? How do we measure belonging and psychological safety? And I think the important message here is that we can. And I think part of the framework actually, which we'll give you, and you know, Chaya and John will give you as well, is that there's a lot of research that says that actually when we start to think about inclusivity and belonging, we can frame that within kind of 4 key areas. So one is a measurement or a sense of fairness and respect, and that's about, you know, do we feel that everybody's voice is heard and respected in equal measure? And there's a series of kind of indicators under that. The next one is under the theme of feeling valued and belonging, and this is about, do you feel that you can come into the workplace and be your authentic self without fear of judgment? You know, can you express who you are? Are there any elements of your identity that you feel you need to hide or leave at the door? That would obviously be the negative flip side of that. The next one would be around being safe and open. And that's about saying, this is really about psychological safety. If mistakes are made, are they accepted as part of the learning journey? Or do you work in a culture which is constantly critical of mistake making? And then the final one, which I think is really important for me, is around being empowered and growing. And ultimately, I feel that, you know, you can value people, you can respect them, you can have their voice heard. But if we don't invest in diversity, if we don't give diverse talent opportunities to shine, then all of the other stuff goes by the wayside. So we can send you more info about these 4 key areas, but I think these are interesting because they help us to measure what we're trying to do and make diversity happen, actually. I'll come on to, if we just quickly go to the next slide, and then I'll hand over. The final thing I want to say is really about saying, if we want to learn to embed inclusivity, we've got to track it in the same way that we track diversity. So it's important that we use the tools that we have in our organizations, such as the employee engagement survey, to collect, analyze, and track inclusion data. So how do we do that? Well, actually, you can see that there's a number of interesting examples on the screen. So Microsoft and LinkedIn both have kind of inclusion tracking systems. And I really kind of like, I've just given you a sample of some of the statements or the questions that they asked. But one of the obvious ones there is that I feel I can be myself, or I feel I belong in my team. Now, I think what's interesting here is that what we want to do as organizations is be able to track that statement across teams, across business units, across countries, etc. But one of the smart things to do when we're thinking of tracking diversity and inclusion is to ensure that we aggregate that information by different social groups. So we may have a headline data that says, hey, and let's go crazy, you know, 90% or 95% of people at Microsoft or LinkedIn feel that they belong in their team. That would be a great result. But then if we analyze that information by gender, by race, by culture, by sexual orientation, etc., all those core characteristics, do those groups align to the benchmark? And I think that's important to think about if we want to be smart in terms of getting some data around inclusivity, as well as the data around organizational diversity. So that's just the kind of headlines from me, actually. I want to now hand over to our amazing speakers who are going to give you much more context and case studies and all of that. Chaya, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for role modeling. How do we make sure that all voices are heard in light of unstoppable passion? Well, having said that, I would request to move on to the next slide, please. And here is where I'm going to talk about a specific DEI activity at LS&Co. Well, Levi's is known to have a long history of standing up for equality, civil rights, and social justice in the communities we work. And as a company, we are reasserting our global commitment to gender diversity in our workplace through key actions. The latest example is an exciting first for us. The doors have opened on our first owned and operated Levi's store in Lahore, Pakistan, 100% staffed by women. Women make up 48.5% of Pakistan's population, yet only about 22% of women are in the workforce. This is a gap for us, and we are determined to bridge. After all, there's a broad consensus that no country can progress without the full participation of women in public life. This is particularly true in the wake of the ongoing pandemic, where women in emerging economies are reporting greater challenges. The recent ILO research has concluded that women in Asia Pacific do 4 times more unpaid care work than men. And we now are at a real risk of losing women in the workforce if nothing is done to guardrail. As you can see on the slide, it shares the executive summary of the initiative. Pakistan has 26 owned and operated stores across 9 cities nationwide. Current female staff is 8% of total retail workforce. This July, we started our journey to increase women workforce in retail to 25% by the end of 2021 and 40% by 2022. LS&Co's first all-women staffed owned and operated store opened in Lahore in July this year, and we plan to launch our next diverse owned and operated store in Karachi that will focus on other strands of diversity. Our aspiration is to reach and maintain at least 40% of women headcount at all our owned and operated stores from 2002 onwards. As we move into our next slide, it talks about specific actions taken under this specific DEI change strategy. The objectives, as you can see listed on the screen, are to amplify Levi as a great place to work for women, showcase our inclusive culture, especially in retail, position retail as a good career option for women, attract and retain best-in-class female talent, and break gender and societal stereotypes in the local context. And lastly, we are using the first store as our prototype for developing and executing enabling policies and support system for hiring and retaining more female talent and assembling an entire ecosystem around it. As for the enablers, you can see the diagram to the right of the screen. I would specifically like to call out the onboarding plan, which includes a DEI workshop. The learning objective of the workshop, which we have as a part of the onboarding plan, it helps to do a market mapping and history on women in business and retail, overcoming bias and recognizing equality, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, attitude, appearance, and enthusiasm in retail context, leading with courage and conviction, and finding one's leadership identity, emotional intelligence, healthy competition, motivation, growth, and lastly, the leading women in the world, inspiring change. Hence, the Levi's store in Lahore is providing vital professional development opportunities for the female employees to help them grow their careers and overcome gender inequities in the workforce. Our teams have worked really hard to recruit amazing talent and provide them with the training so that we can truly deliver the consumer-centric promise we have made to our fans globally. The Lahore store is just the beginning. As mentioned earlier, a second such store is already planned to open in Karachi before the end of this year, which is just about 3 weeks or so. Ultimately, the goal for the organization is to increase female representation in our owned and operated stores in Pakistan to 25% by the end of this year and up to 40% by the end of next year. So this was the specific example that I wanted to share today around how LS&Co has actioned upon creating inclusive cultures to attract and retain talent. Now, I would like to move to the last part and next slide of my presentation and share with you some practical nuances or takeaways on how to nurture inclusive cultures in your respective organizations. So wherever that you were on the poll that you answered, I'm sure there'll be something in here that you could take away today. And for me, the mantra has always been to keep it simple. Looking at the first one that says to integrate inclusivity in the core values and have clear behaviors mapped to it. Well, all organizations should have a set cadence to revisit companies' core values, especially during moments of major change. If your core values don't already include a statement on inclusive culture, engage your leadership to make an update and implement it. To get the most value, ask for suggestions and feedback from employees company-wide, especially if your leadership and HR teams collectively aren't very diverse. The additional perspectives may help and support in creating crucial top-to-bottom buy-in. The second takeaway that I would want to offer is to model inclusive languages. As an HR professional or a DEI leader or whatever role that you play in your organization, you can be a powerful agent of change by showing the way and leading by example. In all professional communications, model inclusive languages, learn and use the preferred pronouns for employees in your company, and for example, use spouse or partner rather than the gendered husband or wife to refer to somebody's spouse, especially if you do not know the gender. Partner also works well for non-married couples, for example. Be very careful to avoid using harmful or hurtful language, especially in a remote setting where words truly define the experience. If you do end up using inappropriate language, apologize, and apologize correctly, and make sure that you sharpen your saw to ensure that you don't repeat your mistake. The third tip up on the screen talks about creating safe spaces, including remote employees. Well, many companies have already done a wonderful job promoting non-binary and gender-queer inclusion by providing gender-neutral restroom. If your organizations haven't already created such a space, consider it. Think just not that, but probably also about other needs for privacy and safe spaces at work, such as mother's room, prayer or meditation spaces, and quiet workspaces for workers who may be distracted or overstimulated by open floor spaces. Well, this extends to remote work as well. Create digital safe spaces by encouraging employees to add pronouns to their email signatures and username. Invite employees to reserve time for prayer and other personal needs by blocking it out on their calendars. Honor introverts by making digital culture events optional. Moving on, expand company holiday calendar and celebrate inclusively. Well, little things mean a lot. And for minority groups, even small instances of representation can make a world of difference. Take a look at your company's holiday calendar. In addition to Christian and secular holidays like Christmas and New Year, be sure to include holidays that represent the religious beliefs of your company at large. If it's not possible to make these company-wide holidays, at least acknowledge them on the calendar to raise awareness and increase the sense of recognition and belonging. Accessible office infrastructure and support to remote employees. Well, in order to welcome all employees as well as visitors, make sure your office is wheelchair accessible, especially common areas like the pantry and restroom. If you're not in the office, if it's remote work, well, then support remote workers by encouraging them to do an accessibility and ergonomics check on their home office. Create a budget to supply them with the tools that they need to succeed. Lastly, highlight inclusivity in diversity training. I'm safely assuming that everyone on this webinar knows that diversity and inclusivity aren't the same thing. Well, Dan spoke to it a while ago as well. But do all your employees know that? It's possible to have a diverse workplace that isn't inclusive. Minority employees, though present, may feel excluded or like they aren't represented in the workplace culture. Raise awareness of that nuance explicitly so that employees can fully embrace the diversity around them and develop the soft skills to thrive in a diverse environment. With that, I come to the end of my presentation as I shortly hand over to Dan. I would like to thank all of you for your patient hearing, and I look forward to hear your feedback and take questions as we get there. And for now, over to you, Dan.
Jai, thanks so much. I mean, loads of amazing stuff in that short and succinct presentation. Actually, it's great. I really like the kind of the inclusive language thing that you were talking about in terms of those top tips. It's really simple and something that anybody can start to implement. And also, I think the holiday calendar, I think, you know, you're right. I think particularly in the APAC region, when we work for Western companies, we're so kind of Western Christian centric that we forget about the diversity, and just operationalizing that helps us, those kind of nudges and things like that. So Chai, amazing, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to hand over to John, and then we can loop back to the Q&A and try and get a few questions in towards the end. So John, good to see you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan. And firstly, I love Chaya's example in Pakistan. That's where I actually started my adult life as a volunteer at 18 years of age. So it has a sentimental place for me as well. Great to see so many ED&I advocates on the call today. It makes it all the more of a privilege to be invited to talk and share some of my own ED&I experiences. And I really wanted to go to the core of ED&I's objectives. And moving on to the next slide, if we think about what are the obstacles to bring one's true and authentic self into the workplace, because we often talk about the objective of ED&I being how do we get people to be their true and authentic selves, which means that they are their most effective performers. And there's various statistics out there. One survey a long time ago estimated that people who could not be their true and authentic self in a workplace were 30% less effective. 30%. So that's saying that anybody who comes from a strand of diversity who doesn't feel included may be only working at about 70% of their capacity. What does that mean, therefore, to your bottom line? So some years ago, this thought process that I went through was triggered by a meeting with a country CEO. I was asked to speak to this CEO a day before she was going to go on stage and talk at a conference on LGBTQ matters in the workplace. And during this half-an-hour meeting, she basically was getting a little confused between a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, BLT, and LGBTQ. She could not yet get the acronym in the right order. And that point of reflection was not that she was not supportive. She was willing to go on a stage in front of several hundred people and talk about it. But the realization that we often talk about tone from the top as being essential to drive a message down into the organization. But how does somebody at the top of an organization know this stuff if they haven't been exposed to it? And at the same time, thinking about another statistic, probably outdated, but some time ago, it was said that 55% of US college students who had come out while at their university and college, so declaring themselves as part of the LGBTQ community, had gone back into the closet, hiding who their true selves were once they went back into the workplace. So why is that? So if we click to the next point, we have to consider what are the obstacles, whether these are real or imagined. As somebody coming from a diversity strand, we often overthink as well. And just clicking through the next few, we have to think about the team. So from a team perspective, what is the risk reward benefit for me to open up to the team about who I truly am? And this relates not only to LGBTQ, but all invisible strands. So for example, I may have a chronic illness that I'm dealing with. What is the benefit for me being open to my team members? What is the risk reward for me being open with my direct line manager? Will he or she then see me as less of a prospect for promotion because they're concerned about the chronic illness impacting my work performance? And even if he's okay, what about the senior manager? Is she okay? Will she feel that she has to hold back from putting me into a position of leadership because of concerns around chronic illness? Or do we have a view that from a customer perspective, do we really want to put somebody who is openly LGBTQ in front of a customer? Now, more than 30% of managers in Hong Kong, when polled, said they would not put somebody they knew LGBTQ in front of a customer for fear of what the customer may think. But we have to remember our customers have the same percentage of diversity as our workforce do as well. What about HR policy? When we come to HR policy, we sometimes say, well, we don't have, for example, a same-sex couple wishing to adopt a child, therefore we don't need a policy. Well, if we do create those policies, it sends very positive messages, and it's not about supporting LGBTQ population, but it's supporting all diversity strands, because you are then seen as a more inclusive organization. If you are ready to work and create policies for LGBTQ population, it means you're also considering gender bias. You're also considering disability. You're also considering ethnicity. So it's really important that we develop those HR policies. And then coming back to tone from the top, we cannot expect our leaders, if we are in March and it's Autism Awareness Month, if you ask me to stand on a stage and talk about autism, well, I would love to support high functioning end of autism spectrum candidates, but do I have the knowledge to stand on a stage and speak about that without somebody spending time and giving me that knowledge, which is why lack of knowledge of all of these things impact how we perform as a team. So moving on to the next slide, what we came up with really was reverse mentoring. And some of you may be familiar with this. When we talk about reverse mentoring, ideally you're identifying subject matter experts, and they are then going to take that message to your leaders. So you're going to find somebody from that population. You're going to train them as SMEs because they may be from a lower rank in the organization and not familiar with how to speak to senior executives. So actually another outcome of this is development of minority or of different diversity strands as well. We need to help them professionalize the presentation. We need to also include the relevant personal stories. Why the personal stories? What we know from presentations, people remember the personal stories. Now, for me, this means a lot to me because when I think about the obstacles, real or imagined, I think about my own career, right? I spent 22 years in international banking, but I was 29 years old when I came out to the very first person in my life as being part of LGBTQ community. 29 years old. So I've spent more than half of my life pretending to be somebody I'm not, conforming, and trying to ensure that I fit in. And going back to Dan's original slide where he was talking about diversity and groupthink, I was fitting into that groupthink, right? I was trying to conform, trying to think of how I can be accepted by the team by conforming and pretending to be somebody I'm not, and possibly being less effective, therefore, as a professional. So once we get these SMEs, the profile, it's a profile and development opportunity for our subject matter experts. And we are creating, going on to the next couple of bullets, the leaders, from a leader's perspective, they are now in a safe space, one-on-one, to learn and build comfort with a subject matter that they may not previously have been comfortable with. And this works for all leaders, all communities. I've done this across the Asia Pacific region. I've taken on the CEO of Malaysia, who was an, let's say, a gray-haired, gray-bearded Muslim, elderly, straight gentleman, talking to him about the benefit of LGBTQ and building D&I into the workplace. What was interesting for me was it actually challenged my stereotype, because he was like, that sounds great, John. How do we drive this forward? What's going to be the outcome? You need to think about the outcomes. And blew my mind away, right? My prejudice, thinking about a bearded, gray-bearded Muslim gentleman talking to him about LGBTQ, he was fantastically supportive and was all about outcomes. So we shouldn't be leveraging our own prejudices. And in terms of outcome, when we think about the things that are developed in my current organization right now, if we go on to the next bullet, we've got the talent acquisition team that are now on message. So very much focused around the D&I agenda. I do new hires talks. Every single new hire listens to me for an hour. I'm not sure whether that's a positive or a negative, but I focus on driving the culture. This is not about performance. They'll get performance every day of their productive lives once they hit the floor. But for me, it's really important to lay the foundations of the culture, talk about the values, talk about D&I, talk about corporate social responsibility. And for me, right, I'm obviously not a lady. What I want to know is, what is the experience of ladies across the Asia Pacific region? So we kicked off a talk, APAC Ladies That Rule, where they would help others, particularly male allies, better understand what are the holdbacks that they themselves go through. And creating those ED&I positive HR policies, which I'll speak to in a moment, And strong employee resource groups is critical to the running of a very strong, diverse and inclusive culture. So, real life example, practical, it works, reverse mentoring. I absolutely love it as a way of really developing and giving a lift to any ED&I agenda. So moving on to the next slide, what has it meant for us in terms of ED&I indicators so far in our PayPal journey? So we hired our first teammate in April 2019. So March 2020, we were in lockdown. So we've hired some 2,300 plus employees. 50% of them have been hired virtually. Okay. Next bullet, 92% in our engagement surveys have said they intend to stay with us. And that is also 92% is our engagement score as well. More than 90% of our leaders have been hired internally. So it's showing that we see that growth from within. So 66 leaders promoted from within. Beyond that, 55% of our senior leaders are female. So one of the senses that I feel is that some of the success is because we really have a strong balance, a very strong female leadership team that are bringing their sensitivities and emotional intelligence to the fore. We've also hired 16 deaf teammates. You know, if you have a passion and you want to go for it and you believe in it, make it happen. Not only that, but as a part of our deaf awareness and deaf integration, we have some 40 hearing employees that can now sign or are learning to sign, including myself. We also have, talking about ED&I positive employee HR policies, we have 13 transgender employees that have availed of transformative surgery. This is huge. This is the first time in the Philippines in the BPO industry where people have availed of this policy, right? And it's obviously it's life transforming for somebody with gender dysphoria. You know, before I arrived in the Philippines, I don't think I had ever knowingly met anybody who was from the transgender community. Now, 6 of our leaders are transgender. 4 of them have gone through this surgery as well. So it's great to see the benefits that we can do. And what does it mean in terms of retention? Well, the final bullet on this slide is possibly the strongest. Single-digit attrition, negligible loss of regretted talent. And if you know the BPO industry, some of you may be familiar, then know that in our industry, we often have triple-digit turnover. So single-digit attrition is pretty amazing. So what about some of the top tips, moving on to the final slide? Creating and sustaining the ED&I positive cultures, that is what is really critical. And when we talk about sustaining, right, what we really want to think is the culture setting is from day -1. Your talent acquisition team have to be on message and driving a message of inclusivity, of belonging, of creating that family environment in your own organization. The communication has got to be consistent through the life cycle. Pre-hiring, hiring, onboarding, hitting production. Throughout that life cycle, consistent messaging. Tone from the top, as we talked about the reverse mentoring, we've got to realize our leaders don't know everything. I definitely don't. I need help to be able to talk. I want to be supportive, but give me the tools so I can run the organization. Leadership expectations, you know, in a D&I, you know, what is it beyond the role or is it part of the role? That's what I often ask my leaders. Do you see ED&I being as something you are doing extra and beyond that you should do in your spare hours? Or is it actually part of your role? If you are a leader, you need to motivate your teams, which means you need to see it as part of your role, not something which is beyond your role and something extra or extracurricular. Employee resource groups, find the right passionate leaders to lead them. They will become outcome oriented with your direction. Embolden them, give them some powers so that they can start to think about what are the outcomes they're driving. These are not organizations that should be just there for everybody to clap their hands periodically. They have to have driven outcomes and run them like a business. That's when they're the most effective. And then finally, one of my favorite points, and this relates to honestly to hiring our dev teammates, right? I was told 3 times that while supportive, I'm not sure the time is right. When is the time going to be right? Make it right. If you find the passion and the belief is there, then you will be able to drive that as an organization. So find those with the passion behind them and let them run. With that, I don't want to take any more time because I want to get to FAQ. So Dan, let me hand back to, or Monty rather, let me hand over to you.
Great, thanks, John. That was really insightful, actually. I've been scribbling a whole bunch of notes here as part of the Robert Walters ED&I Council here. I think some of the council members are hopefully here on this call. We're going to go back and quite a few tips, especially when you talked about, how does someone on top know how to drive, and as a business leader from, if it starts from the top, then, how much education is there. But no, thank you so much for sharing. And Dr. Chaya as well, very inspiring what you've done in Karachi. And I think, as the model inclusive languages, really, really helpful tips. And Dan, thanks for talking about, being clear with language and, investing in diversity. I think some really good tips there. But we're going to open up to the audience for questions. So we already have some questions coming in. So Dr. Chaya, I'm going to open the first question to you. And this is regarding your experience in Pakistan for supporting female employees. Now, supporting and empowering women, but what about the male mindset? Is there a concern there? And how do you execute the change mindset? You talked about change and driving change and the challenges from driving change, but how do you execute something like this in the society and men's mindset? How do you measure this?
Sure, and thank you for the question. Well, there's one thing that we all need to be cognizant about, and that is when we talk about gender, it's just not women, but it's the other half of the equation, which is men as well. And with this specific change management program in Pakistan, we were mindful of that. So right when we started designing the program in terms of how we wanted to have the owned operated stores to be 100% female staffed, we got leadership involved. We got managers involved who were of both genders. And the conversation around was how to sensitize people to understand the challenges that women go through in Pakistan, specifically around the societal stereotypes, the cultural norms, and more so during the time of the pandemic, where while a lot of us were, restricted by lockdowns and circuit breakers around the world, retail continued to work. There were people in stores who were, entertaining clients and walk-in customers. So what we did was we carried out these sensitization workshops where there were open conversations around what are the barriers to include women in the workforce, what are the real challenges that they go through, and what kind of support is required to make sure that we retain them and we help them thrive. And to John's, one of the tip that he had around reverse mentoring, that was something that was that was used heavily as well in terms of making sure that women got to speak their part as well. So one can sit and think about what somebody is going through, but the best way to learn about it is to have the conversation with the person who's impacted the most. And reverse mentoring helped us get those answers. So it was a combination of sensitization workshop, reverse mentoring, which helped to make sure that men were included in the discussion as well, and therefore supporting an effective change management plan.
Great, thanks, Chaya. Actually, funny you mentioned about reverse mentoring because we literally just had a question pop in about reverse mentoring. I think, John, you mentioned, Dan as well. I mean, would you guys like to comment a little bit more about, what does reverse mentoring look like? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, John, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure, okay. Yeah, so ideally what we're looking at is people who come from a particular strand of diversity and asking them to spend time, now whatever it is, 45 minutes with a senior leader and to present to them their own personal stories, personal experiences. So what is it like being, an Asian lady leader? What is it like being somebody from an LGBTQ community in a country where maybe the laws don't support anti-discrimination for LGBTQ? And this allows us to then talk to the senior leaders in a number of ways. One is the statistics, right? Some leaders are driven by numbers. So what does the statistics tell us? What is it that he or she is losing from their organization by not tackling these issues. And then secondly, the personal story, because as I say, people remember the personal stories. One of the other outcomes that is quite common from our reverse mentoring that we see is that the senior leaders then develop a mentoring relationship with that individual. They want to now track that individual's career in the organization. So they want to take an active step. So one of the outcomes, one of the benefits of that is that we are able to really see and drive from within that organization to support those coming from diverse strands. So Dan, I'll cut that short, otherwise you won't have time to.
Cool. The only thing I'd add to that, Monty, is I think it's really important that if you're involved in a reverse mentoring project, if I share my story to a leader, that's my personal story, my personal journey, and that is impactful. But I'm not here to represent the whole of. So I'm not here to represent the whole of the LGBT community or any other community. And I think what's really useful actually as a process is for organizations to utilize their ERGs. So actually when you have a collection of stories, what you end up with is a whole bunch of themes, and then leaders can use those themes to say, okay, well, what is the impact of our behaviors, or what is the impact of our policies on minority groups? And I think that that group mentoring process and connecting with the ERGs as well as the individual reverse mentoring is more powerful than just going to one individual and saying, can you talk to us about what it means to be black, gay, female, or whatever it might be, because that burden of representation is just too much for individuals.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's good advice. Thanks, Dan and John. Listen, it's 2 o'clock. We're going to squeeze in one last question to wrap up. So we've got a question that's just come in, and I apologize to the audience if we aren't able to answer all your questions. Again, it's a hot topic, and I'm sure everybody wants some answers. But last question: how do we tackle cultural discrepancy after organizations merge, go through a merger and acquisition? Who would like to take this question? Dan, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I think I sort of answer it in a roundabout way. I think what's really interesting is, so I work with global corporations that is probably a slightly different example, but we can align the principles, is that work across global jurisdictions with, different cultural norms, different legal frameworks, etc. And, the ones that I've seen that are most successful, they almost say, I tell you what, for now, let's park the legal framework, we'll come back to it. What is it that connects us all? And I think one of the things that connects everybody is around the organizational values. And I've seen a lot of the big global firms do lots to say, hey, look, this is what we stand for. These are our 4 or 5 values, and align to those values are the behaviors that we expect. So it doesn't matter, what jurisdiction you work in, or what, or whether it's the, part of the merger company. If you can start working on a value set, I think everyone's working on the same page. And in a way that becomes much more effective in terms of integrating those cultures than trying to align policies and processes.
Makes sense. I think that's fair enough. Okay, so again, sorry, but we've got several questions coming in, but I don't think we're going to be able to answer them. But a huge thank you, Dan, Chaya, and John. Some excellent insights and actually really interesting action. So I hope everyone here will be able to take away, perhaps start implementing this within your organizations, or even just start thinking about this, investing in diversity, as Dan had mentioned at the beginning. And finally, if you are looking for more ED&I insights, I'd highly recommend you check out our Thought Leadership Library on our website. Or you can actually scan that first QR code on your screen. That would take you directly to our landing page, where we've got a series of publications around how to practice diversity, embracing differences in a diverse workforce. So there's an entire library there, so feel free to look at those publications. And of course, as we've discussed today, global job market, much more competitive than ever. So if you're looking to hire, change roles, or even come work with us, please get in touch with us. You could scan our QR code on the right, and that will take you to our email address. So that takes us to the end of today's webinar. A huge thank you again, and I'd like to wish all of you a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Thank you.